Start with this. East African leaders have issued a warning to armed groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The bloc has urged armed groups to choose dialogue or be considered enemies of all. At the gathering in Nairobi, Kenya, leaders from Uganda, DRC, Burundi and Rwanda have agreed on a dialogue between armed groups and the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo. They say failure to do so by rebels will result in the regional force deployment to root them out of the region. This decision was issued in a joint communique after the leaders met under what is known as the Heads of State Conclave on the DRC. It's the first concerted effort by members of the East African community to have armed groups in the eastern DRC end the violence. To discuss this further, we're joined now by Senior Training Coordinator for the ENACT program at the Institute for Security Studies, Willem Els. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. So let's just take it back a bit, circle on to how we got to this point. By joining the EAC, the DRC increased the bloc's population by a further about 90 million people. So does that make security of the region even more pressing to propel this move?
Good evening to you. Yes, we can see that 90 million people were added to the bloc, but also almost $50 million in the GDP that is expected to rise. So if you want to look at that, you have to look at the country of DRC, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That is one of the biggest countries in Africa and the biggest country in the region. It borders to close to 9 countries, and it's also part of SADC, as you mentioned in your introduction. So if you look further at the Lakes region, that is your eastern part of the DRC, that borders with countries like Uganda, Rwanda and Burundi. It's been a volatile area for quite some time. That is why you have the MONUSCO, the UN forces there, where South Africa is also part of, that has been fighting there for some time. Not fighting, the peacekeeping mission. And then also you have some, since November of last year, you have Ugandan forces that actually moved across the border after there was a twin attack near the parliament buildings in Kampala by a terrorist group or a extremist group called the Allied Democratic Forces, that actually originated in Uganda but is now based in the North Kivu area of the DRC. So what is an international border for these countries is actually just a river to cross for these extremist groups.
Now, I want to talk about why has President Felix Tshisekedi sought the EAC admission when the DRC is already a member of some of the continent's 8 other regional economic communities that you mentioned, including the Southern African Development Community. I think the question here is, does a combined military force mean the possibility of quelling the endemic violence is now more realizable, despite the fact that the DRC has deployed its own military and there's countless international peacekeepers, including from these regions?
Yeah, you mentioned it correctly. It's peacekeeping missions that are there. You know, and it's difficult to keep peace where there's not really peace. So it all boils down to the mandates of these different groups and missions that are deployed in the country. So first of all, you have to look at the demographics. It is volatile. It's a area that borders to most of these 3 countries that we mentioned, where you've got extremely porous borders. There's a lot of trade, but also a very big illicit economy that moves back and forth to this region. So that, on the one hand. On the other hand is, the poor or the lack of good governance that we saw in the recent past in that area led to a lot of dissent and discontent with the people in the area, with the government of DRC. And these people are now prone to actually fend for themselves. As you mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, that the DRC is actually an extremely big country, and if you look at the capital of the DRC, that is in the extreme west of the country, and we see that these areas that we are talking about now are in the extreme eastern region of the country. You don't have a lot of a very good infrastructure between the capital city and these areas, etc., etc. So it is very difficult for a country that does not have the financial muscle to really service these areas in terms of good governance, and to deliver on the social goods that they have to deliver in terms of the mandate with the government that these voters have got. So these voters are actually left to fend for themselves to a great extent, and it makes it very volatile area for these extremist groups to then come in, and they win the hearts and the minds of the people, but also on the one hand, and on the other hand, they also come in because of the lack of presence of the military forces of the DRC. They actually have more or less a free hand to then rule and to serve their purposes there. But another thing that we also must remember, that is one of the most mineral and resource-rich areas in Africa. It's extremely rich in minerals, and that has been exploited by these by these foreign groups, and also these militant groups that have a stake in the mining and the illegal mining of these minerals for their own purposes. So,
let me just jump in there and say this, because the reason I ask this is, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, I have been on several occasions over the years, met with the different military groupings. As you say, the mandate is very important, but these military forces, a lot of them are conflict fatigued. They're almost desensitized to the pain of the communities they serve, the killings they themselves have been accused of being complicit. And I'm wondering what will be new with this new deployment. SADC has had forces deployed in the Eastern DRC since 2013 as part of the UN Missions Force Intervention Brigade. But now the question is, which regional economic communities will lead on resolving the major security strategy here? Who's going to take lead?
First of all, we don't know what the mandate will be of this force should it be deployed. That will determine to a great extent how successful they're going to be and how they're going to operate. We know that there are countries in this bloc that also have a lot of experience. For instance, deploying troops in Somalia. With a mission there, so Kenya is very strong in that. Uganda is very strong in that, and we also see that Rwanda, that has been a big presence in the Central African Republic. It's a big presence in the DRC as well, and also has a big presence in northern Mozambique as we speak. So those are the countries that we believe that will take the lead in this. But one thing that we just need to understand here, and I think that is also maybe you can ascribe the failure of these missions in the past, is that if you go into an area like this where the people are angry, you go into an area where people are exploited, etc., etc. It boils down to good governance. It boils down to a lack of governance, and the people do not. There's a dissent that grew because of that. So if you now go in with a military force, one-dimensional, try to curb the violence and try to bring about peace, what about the rebuilding? What about service delivery? What about what these people really need in order to turn this whole thing around and to restore trust into the government? So I think what will make this deployment of the EAC different, if they can manage to bring that mandate to be more than just one-dimensional, and that means military, to bring in different other projects along with that, restore the peace, and then bring in the projects to uplift the people and to restore their confidence in the government.
So what about the resultant, because I don't think it can be avoided. I mean, part of the reason the DRC is in such turmoil is because of the cross-border incursions, the tensions between the surrounding countries within the Great Lakes regions. You mentioned Rwanda's appointment of troops to Mozambique last year. Now, that was ahead of the SADC forces. That angered some member states by putting SADC solidarity and influence in Mozambique against Rwandan, what was seen as unilateral interests. Could this also have a similar impact?
You rightly mentioned that, Rwanda has been deployed in a SADC region without being a member from SADC, and that created some dissent and some discomfort among some of the countries within SADC. But we also understand that they have been invited there by the Mozambican government, who is a sovereign country, and that created a lot of challenges that it seems they are starting to sort out now. We see better cooperation, etc., between the Rwandan forces and the Summon forces. But to come back to the DRC and what is happening there, like I said in the beginning, because of the porous borders that you have there, these people move back and forth like it's just crossing a river, and the extremists also exploit that. So what you had, for instance, you had the ADF that originated in the Uganda. They came under a lot of pressure because it's a bit more a rule of law is a bit stronger in Uganda than it is in that areas in the DRC that is affected. So these groups just moved there, and now they are launching attacks not only in the DRC itself, but also they are launching attacks back in Uganda, like what happened in November last year. And so if now DRC is part of this community, there's better cooperation, there's better organization between these countries, I think that the chances are good that there will be better coordination on the military front, but also should they then decide to bring in the humanitarian side and the uplifting and et cetera, like the other projects that I mentioned, then I think it will be much better coordinated with the DRC in the fold of the EAC.
Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it. That there is a senior training coordinator for the ENACT program.